In this video, we'll be breaking down everything you need to know about Grace Ashcroft before Resident Evil 9, including story, gameplay, and themes. So guys, without further ado, let's get right into it. Grace Ashcroft is an FBI intelligence analyst, someone whose job is normally done behind a screen and not at the end of a gun barrel. She's the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, an investigative journalist and one of the very few civilians who survived the 1998 Raccoon City incident. That alone places Grace in a very specific position within the Resident Evil timeline. Unlike characters like Leon, Chris, or Jill, Grace didn't choose to fight bioterrorism, but instead, she grew up around it, around the silence, the cover-ups, and the unanswered questions left behind by Raccoon City. By the time RE9 begins, Grace has built a career at the FBI using intelligence and analysis instead of field experience. Even her own superiors describe her primarily as a good technical analyst, reinforcing the fact that she isn't meant to be on the front lines. And that distinction matters, because Grace represents something Resident Evil has rarely focused on, showcasing the perspective of someone who lived after Raccoon City. Not the one who escaped with their guns blazing, but the ones who grew up in its shadow. For Grace Ashcroft, the nightmare did not begin with monsters, but something far worse. In 2018, Grace was staying at the Wrenwood Hotel with her mother Alyssa Ashcroft. At the time, Alyssa was deep into an investigation, one she refused to walk away from, even knowing the risks. Grace, still young and largely unaware of how dangerous her mother's work had become, was left alone in the room night after night as Alyssa followed leads that would eventually get her killed. One night after Alyssa had returned to their room, the warning signs began and came quietly at first. First, a phone call to the room, and then a sudden power outage. Sensing that something was wrong, Alyssa begins to escort Grace out of the building in hopes to escape potential disaster. But before they were able to retreat, things quickly escalated. In the hotel lobby, Grace watched as a staff member was murdered in front of her by a hooded assailant. Panic instantly set in. Alyssa understood immediately what was happening, and did the only thing that she could. She tried to get Grace out. They hid and ran, but before they could leave the building, Alyssa was presumably stabbed to death by the same assailant, right in front of her daughter. Grace survived, but the damage was permanent. She didn't just lose her mother, but she also lost any sense that the world was predictable or safe. And worse still, she never got answers. The man who killed Alyssa vanished, the investigation stalled, and the truth was buried. That night at the Wrenwood Hotel didn't just traumatize Grace, but it froze her in time. And after 8 years go by, the fear is still there, lingering inside her. In the years following her mother's murder, Grace Ashcroft doesn't disappear from the story, but she leans into it instead. Driven by unanswered questions and unresolved trauma, Grace decides to join the FBI, not as a field agent, but as an intelligence analyst. Her role is built around data, pattern recognition, and investigative analysis. Grace does receive firearms training as part of her career, but even within the Bureau, her limitations are clear. Her superior Nathan Demsby openly views her as a capable technical analyst, not someone meant for the frontline operations. She has the knowledge, but not the experience. But that line eventually gets crossed anyway, because while investigating a suspicious death at a government office tied to a newly emerging disease, Grace is summoned to Demsby's office and reassigned. What begins as a routine analytical case quickly expands into something much larger, being a nationwide pattern of unexplained infections and fatalities. The latest incident leads back to a familiar place, being the Wrenwood Hotel, the same location where her mother was murdered 8 years earlier. Despite having no prior field experience, Grace is sent directly into the investigation. She's forced to confront both the professional gap she's never had to face before and the personal trauma she never truly escaped. When Grace arrives at the Wrenwood Hotel, she's greeted by a local police officer who escorts her to the entrance, briefing her on the situation as they move through the alleyway towards the building. But for Grace, this isn't just another crime scene, it's where her past begins to bleed into the present. As the investigation unfolds, Grace starts uncovering details that cut far deeper than she expected. The first is a file, one from her mother Alyssa, hid behind a painting 8 years earlier just before her death. Then comes something even more unsettling, a photograph of Grace herself, taken on the very night her mother was murdered, proof that someone had been watching and waiting. Not long after this, everything begins to spiral out of control. In the middle of her investigation, Grace is abducted by Victor Gideon, one of the central figures behind the unfolding nightmare. From there, she's taken to the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, where Gideon plans to extract her blood and conduct experiments on her, as he believes Grace's blood is the missing key to freeing Elpis, a classified US government operation that's somehow tied to the emergence of the new and deeply mysterious disease. Grace eventually awakens strapped to a chair mid-extraction, her blood already being drained, and in the midst of this, through sheer panic, instinct, and desperation, she manages to break free. Now alone, injured, and terrified, she begins exploring the care center, searching for answers and a way out of the building. And that's when she encounters something far worse, a towering stalker creature that developers are referring to as Mama. This unsettling creature begins to pursue her throughout the facility, and as Grace desperately tries to escape, the enemy eventually corners her and ultimately drags her away. But at the last possible moment, Leon S. Kennedy arrives and opens fire, incapacitating the creature and managing to save Grace. As they finally cross paths and begin to converse about the situation, Victor Gideon initiates a full lockdown of the facility, forcibly separating the two in the process. Concerned for her safety, Leon hands Grace his DSO-issued magnum called Requiem, and the pair split up to find another way out. From that moment on, Grace continues her journey alone through the Chronic Care Center, driven not just by survival, but by a single burning need to finally uncover the truth behind her mother's death and the curse that has followed her ever since. Unlike most RE protagonists, Grace is designed to overcome danger through wit, awareness, and ingenuity, not raw combat skill. The developers intentionally made her more timid and fearful than past leads, emphasizing vulnerability rather than confidence. Narratively, Grace's connection to Raccoon City was not incidental, but foundational instead, because as Requiem ultimately leads players back toward Raccoon City, the team wrote Grace's backstory to tie directly into its legacy through her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft. Gameplay-wise, she is deliberately designed to mirror the player's own sense of vulnerability. Limited resources, restrained combat options, and reactive fear all reinforce the idea that survival comes from caution and intelligence, not dominance. Compared to Ethan Winters, Grace is also far more expressive. Where Ethan often acted as a quiet surrogate for the player, Grace wears her fear openly. She panics, hesitates, and reacts, allowing her emotional transparency to make her feel more human. Grace Ashcroft is introduced as a very different kind of Resident Evil protagonist. Like Ethan Winters before her, Grace lacks real combat experience. Compared to characters like Leon, Chris, or Jill, she is noticeably more timid, more fearful, and far less equipped to deal with the horrors in front of her. That contrast is intentional. Grace exists to recenter Resident Evil around survival horror and not power. This philosophy directly shapes how she plays, as Grace's action options are deliberately limited. She isn't designed to dominate encounters, but to endure them. In fact, the game even includes a classic mode built specifically around this idea, where saving is restricted to ink ribbons, mirroring the tension and scarcity of older Resident Evil titles. Her vulnerability is more reinforced through this perspective. Grace behaves differently depending on whether you're playing in first person or third person. In third person, when chased, she can visibly panic, sometimes stumbling or even falling outright depending on the situation. In first person, however, this behavior is removed. The goal there is immersion. You're not watching Grace panic, but instead you're feeling it. She's also generally faster in first person, further encouraging that more up-close and fear-driven viewpoint. Inventory management continues this design philosophy. Grace's inventory is far more limited than Leon's iconic attaché case. Every slot matters. While it can be upgraded later, early on you're constantly forced to make difficult decisions about what to carry and what to leave behind. Crafting returns as well, but with a new twist. Grace requires infected blood as a core resource, obtained by taking down enemies either through combat or stealth. Stealth kills are especially important, as new tools like the hemolytic injector allow her to eliminate enemies instantly by causing them to violently explode, preventing post-mortem mutations. It's efficient but costly, and reinforces the idea that every encounter is a calculated risk. And there you have it, that is everything you need to know about Grace Ashcroft before Resident Evil 9. And if you want to find out more interesting details about this game, then be sure to click this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.